It's time to go inside the Birds in Focus podcast, a Philly Sports Network show with your host, Nick Faria.
And welcome to episode 8 of the Birds in Focus podcast, where the birds are the focus as we talk about some of the latest headlines surrounding the National Football League. Hi, everybody. I'm Nick Faria. What a week it has been, not only for the sports world, but for this country in general. And normally we would talk about the different topics surrounding the NFL. This week, I want to change the tune a little bit because I think what's been going on in the news and around the country for the last few days, and specifically the last week, is far more important than any other sport at this point. And of course, I'm talking about the death of George Floyd in Minnesota, the officer who has been arrested, and 3 other officers that have yet to be arrested. It sparked outrage throughout the country. It has sparked protests and riots throughout the country. Almost every major city has had a protest and riot over the last couple of days because of the death of George Floyd. Now, this show is going to be done a little differently. We're going to be talking about this issue because this is one of the more important issues of our time. But we're going to be talking about it a little bit differently. A lot of the times, and what we've seen, specifically the last few days, if you look at the videos on the media, through Twitter, through Facebook, through YouTube, there seems to be a disconnect. A disconnect, not from people from different sides of the political aisle, but a difference in cops, officers, policemen, and the people that they are sworn to protect. Now, this disconnect is something that is clear as day. And I think it's very important to highlight this because of what's been going on. And so I interviewed, and just to preview today's show, I interviewed Mike Sprimuli, a detective for the East Providence Police Department, as well as Bill Nebus, Chief of Police of East Providence, Rhode Island. 2 officers, 2 cops that have had a lot of experience as police officers, over 20 years for both men. And I wanted to ask questions about the disconnect between the citizens that they protect and themselves, because there is a disconnect right now. There is a disconnect between what is right and what is wrong. And because of this, I didn't just interview 2 police officers. I interviewed 2 minorities as well, not officers, not people that have been arrested, not people who have been protesting, but 2 different minorities. One is named Dwight Spencer, the other Chris Infante of the Philly Sports Network. And I wanted to get to the bottom of this divide. I want to figure out a chance in a way that I could help this particular issue. How can I get people from 2 sides of the aisle to sit and talk about an issue like this? So I interviewed them separately. And we talked to Sprimuli and Nebus of the East Providence Police Department to figure out where this divide is. How can we solve this divide and where we are right now as a broken country? And is there really as big a divide as we think there is? And I think, and I've interviewed these people already, these are pre-recorded interviews, and I think the biggest thing that I've learned throughout this entire time frame is that this divide isn't as large as we think. I think you're going to see throughout this show, there's connection. There is a connection between the police and the citizens that they protect. There is that group that agrees with everyone. You've seen videos where police officers actually join the protesters. It's a very big thing. And this disconnect isn't always there as we may believe and perceive to believe throughout the media. And I'm going to highlight that in a little bit. But the other piece of that, because this is a sports network, I want to center this around the athletes as well. Carson Wentz, Zach Ertz, 2 Philadelphia Eagles, 2 of the biggest names in Philadelphia sports, right now spoke out against against the injustice that happened to George Floyd. Carson Wentz, with an eloquently written post on Twitter, I think it was probably one of the more eloquent readings that you saw throughout this time frame. And I'll just read an excerpt here for you. Being from North Dakota, I've spent a large part of my life surrounded by people of similar color. So I'm never going to act like I know what the Black community goes through or even has gone through already. I'll never know the feeling of having to worry about my kids going outside because of their skin color. However, I do know that we are all equal at the foot of the cross, and Jesus taught us to value others' lives like they were our own, regardless of skin tone. And that's very powerful from Carson Wentz. That's a very powerful excerpt. And if you look at the whole thing, look at his Twitter page. I'm not going to read the whole thing because I do want to get to these interviews with Bermulli, Nebus, Infante, and Spencer. But again, as I'm prefacing, I want to say this. I'm not picking a side here. I want you, the viewer, to see where this goes. I'm not going to tell you how to think in this retrospect. I'm showing you the different sides of the aisle because there's a disconnect between the officers and the people they protect. And I want to show you that this disconnect might not be as big as we may perceive through social media. So let's get to it. Let's listen to Mike Bermulli and Bill Nebus. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me. I want to start by getting your overall thoughts on the George Floyd death and what actually happened between Floyd and the police officers that should be or potentially should be charged with his death.
I'd say that when I first saw it, I thought it was egregious. We as a division at the department watched it together. And not only did we all come to the same conclusion as it being egregious, but that it was also criminal. It's not something that we've ever been taught. It's not something that should be done. And to be honest with you, in 22 years of police work, I've never seen anybody do that. At least nobody that I've worked with. Because
just because you're in a police officer's position, you're still human. And when you see that being done and a casual conversation taking place between bystanders who are trying to say, hey, buddy, please get up. Like he's asking, it appeared to me that everything was under control. It doesn't appear that any assault was taking place. It doesn't appear that anybody was in any kind of danger other than George. And it's unfortunate, the outcome of this. And what's also unfortunate is the calm manner in which the officer tried to describe his reason behind his reaction, saying, I believe it was something about this is what happens when you take drugs and things like that. And that's not a proper reform measure to take.
So let's talk proper measure to take. As a cop and as someone who goes through, and you're talking about 22 years on the force, what's the correct procedure for something like this? If you're talking to a bystander and there's a discussion or if there's an argument going on, what's the correct procedure from the bystander and for the officer as well?
Well, the first thing you should always try to do is de-escalate the situation. Hands-on is always the last approach. You try to talk the person down. Try to get their version of events. Try to get them to calm down. Try to get them to talk to you. And I think that's the most important thing. You should never immediately go to hands-on unless the situation calls for it, where you're either threatened or the person's carrying a weapon. You want to talk them. You want to de-escalate it.
To me, cops are inherently lazy, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but they'd rather get the job done with the least amount of force required. They'd rather go out and not have to arrest anybody during their shift. If you're arresting somebody, that means somebody is either getting hurt or committing a crime. They would love to get through their shift with doing community kind of resource actions, where they're going to the schools, where they're reading to the kids, things like that. And you say, how do you bridge the gap is exactly that. You care. If you care about every single call that you go on, I don't care if it's your 15th stolen bicycle of the day, that 15th person should have the same amount of care behind this report, because to them, it's horrible. A little kid lost his bike, and they're looking to you to assist them. So the bottom line is caring. And if you care about each call that you go on as the other person being a person, a father, brother, sister, what have you, family member, then our job becomes easier. So you take the most difficult job in the world, and it becomes extremely easy when you care.
So in this case in particular, 4 cops, a lot of people are screaming for them to be arrested, to be prosecuted under criminal charges, as you were saying. But in a case like this, so let's say someone in your division commits a crime like this. Do you feel that it's your job not only to talk to that officer, or do you feel that it's a position of, look, he's one of my brothers, I have to protect him, or do you feel that he broke the law and we have to prosecute him? He broke the law, this is bad.
It's a case-by-case basis. Any investigation that you conduct should be fair and impartial. You have to take the facts and go in where the facts take you. And that's the most important thing, and it's regardless. I mean, I've been around where police officers have been prosecuted. I've been involved in cases and testified where cops have been deemed to have done illegal things or unethical things. But it doesn't matter who you are. And as police officers, we're held to a higher standard. And we should be held to a higher standard because you're given a lot of power to go out there and do this job. You have the power to take somebody's freedom away. And with that comes a lot of responsibility. There's nobody that good cops hate more than bad cops. And that's something that I've always thought about. You have to take the responsibility, and you have to uphold the oath that you took. And when you don't do that, to me, it's worse than some of the things that criminals out there do.
To me, I can comfortably say that wouldn't happen in East Providence because, and I hate to judge officers, that's why it's a touchy situation because I was not in their shoes, I was not at that call, I don't even know the facts completely to the call, what the actions may have been ascribed to the dispatcher and then the dispatcher to this cop, so I really, there are a lot of details left out, but I can comfortably say by what is shown to me that wouldn't happen in East Providence because with the officer standing there and having the other officer who's kneeling on Mr. Floyd having a casual conversation, I think any officer in this department would say, hey, I'll take him. You can deal with these people that are filming you. You can do this. I'll take care of him. And that essentially protects the officer too. So I think the actions of another officer would have protected Chauvin, if I have his name correct. I'm sorry, because he would not be out of a job right now. We wouldn't have lost a life. We still would have had eyes open because he did commit somewhat of an act, but interrupting the fatality. It still would have gotten attention. But he still would have had a job, and the situation could have been diffused much better. And I think here in East Providence, we would have had anybody, whether it be a supervisor or a fellow patrolman or anybody else would have intervened and said, I got this. They would see that this was something that was probably going the wrong way.
So in terms of the backlash that's happened, riots are going off almost everywhere in the country. Almost every major city, there's been a riot or a protest. As an officer, in a situation like this, you mentioned before about de-escalating the situation, and you've seen many videos where officers try to de-escalate the situation. You've also seen some officers that are being a little bit aggressive towards the protesters and the rioters itself. In your retrospect, if something like this happened in East Providence or in this state, how would you react to that, and would it be different than what other cities are doing?
I can't say exactly what other cities are doing because, like most of us, we're getting our information from the media. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I can't answer that. But as to say there's a difference between protests and riots, I think everybody has the right to a peaceful protest. And from a personal standpoint, I don't blame them for protesting this incident. Like I said, when we first started talking, it's an egregious act. It's criminal. And I can tell you right now that 99.9% of officers feel the same way. Mm-hmm. I felt that this could have been an opportunity to almost bridge the gap between police officers and the communities that have been affected by this, because on this particular case, we were all in agreement. Mm-hmm. We all agree. We all agree that somebody should have been prosecuted for this. So I just think that dealing with rioters and dealing with protesters, it's different. Rioters, their goal is not to go out there and get justice. In my opinion, the goal is to go out there and be disruptive, to create problems. And we wouldn't allow people to come in here and have their livelihoods and businesses destroyed, by people who really are just there, not because of the incident that happened to Mr. Floyd, but just to come in and create problems.
The problem is perceived. then the problem is real. So although the police may not feel that we have a divide in our community, if the community feels that there's a divide, it's up to us to make sure that they believe that there is no divide. So even if it's a perception on their part, it's a real problem. We would have reached out to the community, and we have in the past. We have a great relationship with our citizens in this city. I couldn't ask for anything better. And we would meet and say, hey, how do we do this together? How do we get everyone to believe that this wouldn't happen here? Or if this did happen here, the actions would have been taken immediately.
Athletes around the country, specifically in the National Football League, have spoken out about this. Carson Wentz has spoken out, quarterback for the Eagles, Derek Carr for the Raiders, Zach Ertz, you're talking about a lot of very good players around the NFL. Do you feel, and I think this is a good question before I get to Kaepernick, before I get to other players from around different leagues, do you feel that as NFL players, as professional athletes, as even celebrities, they have a right to sit there and as you say, protest the situation at hand and what happened, as opposed to pushing for riots?
When you ask that question, are you talking about protesting at games or
like right now what they're doing? So speaking out to the media.
Oh, absolutely. Everybody has the right to express their opinion as long as it's not violating somebody else's rights. Mm-hmm. You can say and interpret a situation however you want. And like I said, I can understand there's anger behind this incident. I can understand that. Just by watching it myself, I felt the same way. So yeah, I think they have every right to come out and express their opinion.
You know, initially I have to say I was against it because I felt it was disrespectful to the men and women who go out and serve our country. And the funny part was I learned through that event from Kaepernick taking the knee because the service members were the most for it. Mm-hmm. They said this is what we fought for. We fought for people to be able to show their beliefs and their opinions. So that changed my thinking in my mind, and then, you know, obviously that is a much more way to protest, much more peaceful way to protest than what's going on. From what I understand, there were some police officers in Philadelphia that were hospitalized because of the riots. What did those Philadelphia officers do in Minnesota? Now, we have to look at the history of Minnesota, which I've never really known much, and now I'm only learning from posts and things online, so it's got to be fact-checked. But to me, it sounded like there was always a racial divide in Minnesota from day one, not even just between police. There were covenants that allowed people to buy houses in certain areas, and it disallowed people to buy houses in certain areas. When those were made illegal, what the state came out and did is put an interstate through where the area was divided anyway. So essentially, they remained the divide, and there seems to have been racial tensions in that city from the start prior to this event. So,
and I'll ask you this first, when it comes to Colin Kaepernick. Kaepernick, when he started kneeling, it was talking about police brutality and injustice for African Americans. Do you feel there's a difference with what he's been saying in the media and what other athletes have been saying?
Yeah, I saw a most recent tweet, mm-hmm. and it seemed to me, based on the most recent tweet, that he was encouraging not just protests, but encouraging the riots. Mm-hmm. So I did see, and I don't remember exactly what the quote was, but I did see it posted, and it was far different than, you know, some of the other comments I see. Now, I frequently see Ben Watson out there talking, mm-hmm. and I think he's extremely articulate, intelligent, and he's always very philosophical about how he gives his views on things. He's someone that you can listen to, and whether you agree or disagree with certain points that he's making, he always makes it so that you can understand it, mm-hmm. and it's not divisive, but it's educational. So those are the type of things, as far as, you know, I'm concerned, when I see certain tweets that encourage violence, mm-hmm. As opposed to tweets that are, or comments from professional athletes that are bringing attention to what they perceive as to be an injustice.
So, I want to leave this interview off here. If you were to give a message out to the country right now, what would it be during this entire issue, and with the pandemic going on, and then with the death of Mr. Floyd and everything else, of the riots and protests that have been going on?
Back to what I had said earlier, 99.9% of the police officers are good. They go in there, they try to do their job. Their purpose is to protect their community. And to a person, everybody that I've spoken to, everybody that I've heard from, and everybody that I've seen on social media condemns these actions. I have not seen anybody, any police officer, supportive of what this person did. We've all been in difficult situations out on the street. We've all had to go hands-on. We've all had to make split-second decisions. And it's like, you're a sports writer. I mean, we as fans of football, we sit there and we critique professional athletes' decisions all the time, even though we've never been in that situation. So yes, they have the right to critique, they have the right to question, but they should also understand that the actions of those officers in Minnesota are not indicative of the actions of a majority of the police officers that go to work every day to try to do a good job. So, I mean, I would say that if you want to protest, peaceful protest, it's encouraged. And I can guarantee you that the cops would open up roads and let you, as long as it's done properly, they will open up roads and let you protest whenever you want. But when it turns to violence, that's where it's got to stop.
Yeah, just we are with you. We care. We care as a community. We want this problem resolved as much as the country does. We want the perceptions to go away. We don't want to be generalized, and we don't want to generalize others. Whatever we can do to bridge this gap, we would do it, and peacefully is the best answer. From what I understand, there were no incidents in Providence, and it was the perfect way to get their message across when you have a large group of people who played by the rules, they made their points, they had their signs, and nothing was damaged.
Well, thank you guys so much for joining me and giving me the opportunity to interview you guys during this time.
Thank you.
And again, a big thank you to Mike Spumuli and Bill Nebus of the East Providence Police Department. Mike Spumuli, a detective for East Providence, and Bill Nebus, the chief of police of the city of East Providence. And really an informative conversation was had throughout that entire 15-minute talk about what the thought process was for officers throughout the country, and not just particular in that particular city of East Providence. Something to look forward to and something to look at when you really think about what has been going on throughout this country. Now, when you talk about, okay, Nick, you brought on a police officer, why don't you talk to some minorities who might have a different opinion? And I think that was very important as well. So I went looking around, and of course, Chris Infante of the Philly Sports Network, he runs the Flipping the Birds podcast with Brian Cameron. I tried to get Brian on as well, but we got Chris on, and he was very informative. And you're about to hear this interview as well. And I think it's very important. And again, I'm not going to tell you what to think. I'm not going to sit here and say, well, the police officers said this, so lay off every other police officer there is. Stop rioting. I want you to come to this opinion after listening to so many people. Create your own opinion because of everyone else that has spoken. So we bring on Chris here. And Chris, thank you so much for joining us. And I want to start off this interview by asking the same question I started out with the officers in question, in Spumuli and Nebus. What were your overall thoughts on the death of George Floyd?
In a word, despicable. It's this whole situation, as soon as I saw that happen, for me personally, it hit in two ways. It hit me as a minority. My background, I'm Puerto Rican. So obviously my experiences with racism and all that are a lot different than those of black people. But I have experienced it in many, many forms growing up in a very, very predominantly white community. So seeing a white officer do that to a black man, we've seen that story over and over and over again, unfortunately. It was just, there was no way for me to hear anything that could have, defended the action. And then on the other side of the second way it hit me was, I'm from an NYPD family. My dad was in NYPD for 29 years. So to see, obviously he's the officer is in Minnesota, but the blue line's the blue line. It goes across the nation. So to see yet another bad, horrible, despicable, evil cop tarnish what the real great officers and cops and detectives and lieutenants and sergeants go through every day, to tarnish that legacy, it's like, now all these cops that really do great in this nation are going to come still, get targeted, and it's such an incredibly sad situation, where an evil cop with an agenda. He definitely had an agenda in my mind, and he succeeded in that agenda because we have another black man killed. But now the ripple effects. It's like it's not just a ripple; it's a wave that it started, and it's extremely sad. It's as soon as I saw that happen, I was like, shit's about to go down. Essentially, excuse my language. It was just something to me that what's going on today. I saw it coming from everything that those actions that happened that day.
Well, let me ask you, because and I'm interested in seeing this, because when we asked the two police officers, one's a chief of police, one's a detective, both have served over 20 years. Both of them unequivocally said that they feel the officers involved in this case should be charged. Do you feel, and I'm sure you feel the same way, you've already said it, but do you feel that all four, regardless of what happened, regardless that three others didn't have the knee on George Floyd's neck, they should all be charged as well?
100%. They were all complicit in it. I think I saw a video that came out today where I forget what location it was, because at this point there's really too many locations to keep track of with where all the protests are happening. Where a protester was on the ground, being restrained by one officer on his arms, and then another officer was helping that officer, but the helping officer had his knee on the guy's neck also. But the first officer, I guess, when he realized that the guy's knee was on the guy's neck, the same way George Floyd died, that officer ripped his knee off and put it on the guy's back. So why was it so hard for the other officers in the Floyd situation to hear out the calls of Floyd saying I can't breathe? Why can't they just tell Chauvin, move your knee back? Just you could restrain him with your knee on his back.
Mm-hmm.
That autopsy report. I'm not going to put any stake into it until the full one comes out, and who knows when the full one comes out if it really is going to de-escalate anything, because the preliminary already stoked the flames even more. Because it's just, to me, that knee on that neck did not expedite George Floyd's whatever he had, underlying conditions. If his conditions would have killed him, we would have killed him before. That knee on his neck did not just all of a sudden, oh, now this is going to help, kill you because you have other crap going on in your body. No, that knee on his neck suffocated him and it killed him. And he had an agenda with that. The other officers should have stepped in and said, nope, there are other ways to restrain him. Restrain him this way. Put your knee on his upper back. He would still be on the ground, not moving, because there's not much difference between where his neck is and where his upper back is. Yeah. But the main difference there is he can breathe one way and he can't the other way.
It's interesting that you say that, Chris, because ironically enough, the officers that we interviewed said the exact same thing. You want to de-escalate the situation is pretty much what they said. And they aren't trained to put their knee on their neck. So they were a little confused as to why that happened, per se. What are your original thoughts on that? If other police officers are sitting there saying, this isn't how we train either, we're kind of confused as to why they did that.
That just shows me that, the officers that do these things with the knees on the neck and all this other stuff are joining the force for other agendas. Obviously these officers that you spoke to were trained to do the right thing. They swear to serve and protect, and that the officers that you spoke to are doing that. They're serving and protecting, and to do so, you need to do things the right way. You need to go about things the right way. And when you see officers like Derek Chauvin, do things the way he did it, he didn't join the force to serve and protect. He joined the force so he can police his own, agenda, so to speak. He because when the report came out that he and George worked together at some point, you could see that he had something when he pulled this guy over and saw who he was, or he knew who he was when he pulled him over. He knew exactly what he wanted to do. So he wanted to join the force to get back at whoever wronged him, or whoever crossed him the wrong way and things like that. That's not what being a police officer is about. Being a police officer is about helping those in need and making sure that families stay as families and stay connected. That whoever leaves their house gets to go back to their house at the end of the day, no matter where they are. That's the purpose of being a police officer. My dad, like I said, 29 years. He retired many, I think 5-6 years ago at this point. But when I was growing up, I grew up in the Bronx, and the Bronx is not the safest place in the world either. It's and there were many nights that I didn't know if my dad was going to be coming back, especially on 9/11. He was one of the first responders down there. So, to see all these people, these police officers, just tarnish the shield that they were given because they swore to serve and protect, it's extremely saddening, and it's incredibly evil. It's but the officers that he spoke to are obviously on the right side of things. Things are extremely bad, to put it in the lightest term possible, when people in your own force, for the most part, for the extreme most part, are saying you did things the wrong way, and that's what you see here. Almost every officer you talk to, whether it be you, me, anybody's talking to officers, are saying that this guy needs to go to jail and be charged. I personally think he deserves a higher degree. I understand that the video, as more evidence comes out, I hope that the charges get strengthened. But the first video that comes out does tend to go to the third degree portion of it. But when you add in the facts that they knew each other, that directly goes into Derek had an agenda. He knew exactly what he wanted to do, so that's first degree. This guy needs to go out for life, and I can't imagine if this guy gets off. I can't imagine what things will happen if he gets off.
So let me ask you this, and this conversation, it centers around not just what happened with Floyd, but it centers around the riots and what athletes have done since then. And I want to focus on the riots and protests right now, because there is a difference from what we're seeing in Newark and other cities, particularly in Providence where I'm from. It was a very peaceful protest. They made their case. The protesters made their case. They were heard, and police officers stood aside and let them do whatever they wanted. The riots, on the other hand, in a lot of different cities, you're seeing aggressive police officers and aggressive police movements countering these riots. So I want to ask you from this perspective, as someone, again, as a minority and as someone who has a family member in the force or had been in the force, when you look at what's been going on with these riots and protests, what is your thought process through this?
I think I tweeted out something today where I said it's crazy how in some cities you have officers supporting the Black Lives Movement and walking around arm in arm with the protesters, and then you have other cities where you have officers who are meeting them with weapons. And it's, in my opinion, the protests turn to riots in the response to what they are greeted with. You saw Newark, you saw even Camden of all places. Yeah. One of the highest crime rates in the whole nation. You had police officers joining arm in arm, raising their fists up because they met these protesters as protesters. They met them as people who wanted to see change, and these officers are fed up also, because I'm sure they are all terrified for their own lives, even more than before. I mean, to be an officer in Camden, I can't imagine how terrified you are to go to work and hope that you come home. but especially nowadays. But if you're an officer and you meet these protesters like who they want to be, protesters, you're going to get a response like you've seen in like you said, in Providence, and you've seen in New Brunswick, and have you seen in Camden. You've seen for the most part in New Jersey and in New York. Well, the city is a little bit of a different story right now. It's been these officers going hand in hand. So that's when protest day is protests. It turns to riots when all these protesters see the riot shields come up. They see the tear gases coming. They see damn cars being plowed through crowds. When these people are seeing the officers are even going after them before they have even done anything, that's when it turns to riots, because then they see themselves as targeted. Mm-hmm. I saw a video today. I think it was in Minneapolis. It was a suburb where police department were marching through suburbs, and people were being ordered off of their balconies. They were out the balconies looking at these officers, and they're saying, if you don't go in, we will shoot. So when you're an officer and you have a whole unit doing that, what do you expect the response to be? You're not going to get people saying, "Oh, I'll just hold my sign up while you have tear gas on my face." I can't remember. I think it was actually in Dallas. A girl was walking home with groceries, just with groceries, and she got a rubber bullet on her forehead. And just an inch lower, it would have gone in her eye. She would have been blind in one eye. So for some officers in these cities to just be trigger happy, because they finally got some action. I'm sure you saw the video of the little twerp. I'm gonna call him a twerp. I forget what city it was in, where he was like, "Oh yeah, I'm ready to go. I'm ready to go." He was ready for some action. When you're an officer and you have that mentality, you're inviting people to turn protests into riots, and that's not what the main protesters want. Mm-hmm. As a minority, I want change. I'm not going to go into a store and burn it down to the ground, but I want change. But I hate violence. I don't want violence because, again, I would never want my father on the streets right now. Because who knows? If you're a rioter, you're going to go after officers that have nothing to do with what happened in Minnesota, and you're trying to hurt them and keep them from their families when all they're trying to do is just keep the peace. The good officers. The bad officers are trying to keep the peace by just, arresting everybody and anybody, especially even reporters.
So you feel that the reason that these riots have turned to riots when they originally started as protests is how the police have reacted to them. So if they react to the protests with, as you were saying, these riot shields and these gases, that's what changes them into riots. It's very interesting. And I think you have a fair point there, because it's not just one or the other. There's always a cause action. There's always something that starts it. And that doesn't mean that it always has to be the people that started it. I think you make a very smart and interesting point when it comes to that, Chris. I do want to switch gears here, because I think this is also very important. Because we are the Philly Sports Network, we center around sports. Athletes everywhere have spoken out against the Floyd murder, specifically that of Carson Wentz and Zach Ertz, two of our beloved Eagles. In your mind, how important was it that Carson spoke out, that Ertz spoke out, and should they? And even if it's not the case, should they be the ones speaking out, or should it just be specific people from different places? Should it be a Kirk Cousins speaking out? Should it be people that have been specifically in those cities? Those athletes should be speaking
out. I think it should be a nationwide thing. It shouldn't be just, for every time that something happens, you see celebrities, athletes, people in quote unquote power talking about it, no matter where they are. The fact that Carson and Zach spoke up, I think, speaks volumes to their character. And I think people have been, not so much Zach, because Zach's been a little bit more outspoken than Carson in the past. But for Carson to come out and say what he said speaks volumes for one, his maturity, and two, his leadership. Because I assure you, no one was expecting Carson to say anything. Carson's such a soft-spoken guy. He just had a daughter. He has his own family to worry about right now, and he was open about it. People were a little nervous when they started reading his paragraph because there was kind of a but in there, and they were like, all right, what is he going to say? Because being from North Dakota, people would automatically assume, all right, this guy, he's country, he's 100%, make America great again. He's that kind of quarterback, but we can't really talk about that because he's our quarterback. But to see the way that he responded, definitely one, if you were a Carson Wentz hater before, you're not one now. Seeing that, even though you shouldn't have been in the first place. But to see him take that stance, definitely, I feel like allowed more people to feel comfortable talking about the issues. Because I feel like some people don't like talking about the issues because they don't know how their favorite athlete, for whatever reason, feels about it. And seeing the leader of our favorite football team talk about it, seeing one of the best players on the team talk about it, and more people, I'm sure, will start to speak up more. The legends are starting to speak up too. We've seen McNabb talk about it. We've seen Westbrook talk about it. It's refreshing to see because now people from all races, especially when you talk about two races, white and black, and you see Carson talking about Black Lives Matter. You're starting to connect more races together. When you just have a black athlete talk about it, not to say it's not going to speak volumes, because it does, it always does. But when you see people of other races, you see white people talk about it, you see Spanish people talk about it, you see everybody talk about it. That's connecting everybody together because to be thought of as an athlete who says all lives matter without acknowledging that all lives matter won't matter until Black lives matter. That's something that helps tremendously, and that's what Carson is doing there. He's making sure that everybody knows that we can't say all lives matter unless we know for a fact Black lives matter, and it's the truth. There's people running around saying we shouldn't say Black lives matter. We should be saying all lives matter. But those people saying all lives matter are the ones that are screaming at the protesters. So their lives are lower than yours in your opinion, but I thought you said all lives matter. And so it's a slippery slope that I think Carson and Zach took perfectly. And it's whether Kirk has said anything or not, I'm not sure, but to only have athletes from that city wherever it happens talk, I think it would keep the issue smaller than it is, and it would never be solved. Whenever racism happens, whenever a hate crime happens, it should be brought up so the whole country can know about it and learn about it, so the issue can be solved or work to get a problem. Because an issue like this is never going to be solved, but at least there can be steps taken to solve it or get close to a solution, and that will come through athletes using their platforms to talk about it. No matter how many haters will come out and say, no, well, you're wrong, you're just another puppet or whatever, they're going to block out that noise and use their power, use their platform to help unite the country, and that's what Carson and Zach were doing.
Chris, I want to ask you one question here that is going to be pretty different, because the officers brought it up because they felt that it was a clear distinction between one person saying something and the other, and that's Colin Kaepernick. One of the officers mentioned how when he learned more about how different officers and different military men were responding to Kaepernick's original protest, he sort of changed his tune and understanding that he has every right to kneel before the national anthem and everything else that happened. But Kaepernick spoke out about these riots, almost saying, continue to riot, continue to burn down these places until you're heard. And I want to ask you, do you feel there's a difference between what Kaepernick is saying and what Carson Wentz or other athletes are saying?
I think there is a different. I think the way that Carson and other athletes are talking about right now play to what Colin's original message was. You know, Colin's original message was peacefully protest. You know, and in my mind, if that was heard and he wasn't ridiculed and he wasn't, you know, sent out the league because of it, we really wouldn't have many of the issues we have today. Because a lot of these protesters that are getting, you know, vilified for what they're doing, people are saying, well, you should be peacefully protesting. You shouldn't be doing this. And they're coming back with, we tried to peacefully protest, but then you told us not to kneel, and then we're doing this. Now we can't do this. So what are we supposed to do? But what Colin's saying right now is, what we tried to do before, you didn't want us to do it, so we got to take action. So I don't, you know, that's different from what Carson and Zach are doing, because Carson and Zach aren't necessarily condoning what's happening to all these businesses and all the fires that are going on, because to be completely honest, I don't see the point in that either. I understand that people are saying that without action, this is going to be our reaction. You know, we're gonna keep doing stuff until action is taken, but at the same time, what action is going to be taken on all these businesses and buildings that are essentially hurting other people that have nothing to do with the what's going on? You know, a lot of these small businesses will never be able to open up again, and thus that's destroying someone else's life that you don't even know, that you have nothing to do with. And I understand that a lot of these fires that are being started are not necessarily the protesters that are coming in. A lot of these people are coming out of city, no matter what the city is, or it's Minneapolis, whether it's Philly, you know, whether it's Dallas, whether it's New York City. There's a lot of people coming in just to spark stuff, and that's where a lot of people in this country, unfortunately, you know, get off of. They love chaos, and they're coming in to spark chaos. And so when you see athletes like Colin Kaepernick now saying keep rioting, it is a little bit disheartening, because you would think that a guy that worked so hard to have that platform that he did when he kneeled would just come out and say, listen, now you can see why I kneeled. I know what I know, you know. So, but continue to try and put your message across by doing that message. Don't go off and destroy cities, because what is that going to do? That's going to create more problems for us to solve, when the real problem is the institutional racism that a lot of people are facing right now. You can't fix that in a burning building. So I don't like how he changed his message from what he did to what he is doing now, but I do like the fact that more athletes are going to his original message and trying to help in that way. Maybe it'll bring Kaepernick back to where his original message was, but I think the more, and you're seeing a lot of athletes in football, you're seeing it in wrestling. You're seeing a lot of wrestlers come out that people had no idea would have these stances. I think Randy Orton and Roman Reigns. You know, people see that, they're like, wow, I never thought these people would say that. But when they're saying these things, maybe it'll finally hit home for people at home, that we all need to sit together and peacefully make something happen. But then you're gonna stoke the flames more, no pun intended, when Kaepernick says what he's been saying with the riots. And it's just, I just hope soon that we find a middle ground, to have one unified voice where it's, let's make change, but without the riots. And it starts at the top, but we don't know if it's going to start at the top.
So, Chris, one more question for you, and I think that was eloquently said, and I absolutely agree with you on that one. Your final, if you were to give one message, we had the officers say the same thing, and they were pretty consistent. We are hurting with you. We understand. We're there for you. The good officers are there for you, and we're going to do everything we can to fix this. What would your message be to the country? If you had a microphone and you could speak to everyone, what would it be?
This has been something that I've always thought about. Like this is the first time I'm hearing your question, so it's kind of, but it's something that I've always thought about growing up, because, like I said before, I grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood. I grew up in the Bronx for 13 years. And it was all of us. It was Puerto Ricans, blacks, whites, Indians. We were all down there. And then I moved up to Rockland County, New York, where I was one of 5 Hispanics in my school. In my graduating class of 130, I think I was one of 5 or 6 Hispanics, and there was 2 or 3 black kids. So all my life, no, not all my life, all my teenage life, I was, ridiculed for my color of my skin. I've been called every slur word for a Hispanic person you could think of. In college, I was also, targeted by some racism. And throughout all of that, I always, no matter how much anger I had and how much I wanted to do something, I always was brought back to just thinking about what my parents would wanted. They wouldn't want me to see me in jail, especially my mother. She would bail me out of jail just to kick my ass. But I wasn't doing what I was doing in school and all that to throw it all away. So when I thought about that, I always went back to these people who targeted me and say, listen, why do you think that way? Why do you do that? And right now I'm in a marriage where my wife is white and my daughter is half Puerto Rican, half white. And when we started dating, her side of the family had a lot of views that didn't really align with what I thought. A lot of things they said wasn't the greatest things towards black people and Hispanics. But I knew that wasn't my wife. I would have been with my wife if that was the case. But the thing is, you got to talk to these people. And my message is you have to find these people who hate so much and have a conversation, because that's where debates start. That's where action starts. They start with conversations. And when you have a conversation that with someone who has a different viewpoint than you, especially if someone doesn't like you because of the color of your skin, say why? Why? And when you start that conversation with that simple question, if they don't have a legitimate, there's no legitimate answer for why you can't like someone for the color of your skin. So when they really can't answer that question, that's where you can start. Say, okay, so you don't like me for the color of my skin just because you don't like me. Well, this is who I am. And then when you start listening and learning about people that are different than you, then you can start connecting the dots. Because right now, it's not a liberal versus a conservative, not a left versus right thing. It's non-racist versus racist in this battle right now, and because you could see people on both sides that are surrounding that idea of racism versus non-racism. Once this is all over, if it is all over, it'll go back to being left or right, and it sucks that for the extreme left and extreme right, it is still a left versus right thing, because people on the right think it's liberals that are doing this, and people on the left are saying, well, the conservatives are doing this. It's not that. It shouldn't be a political thing, and unfortunately the media is painting it that way at some point. But what it is it's people who do not understand, which are the racists, and the people who want you to understand, which are the non-racists. And the non-racists want the racists to understand that we are not a problem. We are people that breathe like you, that love like you, that have families like you. We are in a country where that has been brought to immigrants as come here and you have the American dream. We are a melting pot. What kind of melting pot American dream are we doing right now? And that the dream doesn't come back until conversations happen. And people start understanding each other more, and it doesn't go to the same white people saying I'm not racist, I have one black friend. That's not gonna happen. You need these white people and other racists who are not even white. It's not just a white person thing. There are black people who are racist against Hispanics. There are Hispanics who are racist against blacks. It's all over. There's racism all over the country. That won't end until conversations happen. And if someone doesn't want to have a conversation with you, then they have their own issues to worry about. But if you have someone that has so much hate towards either you or another race that sit with them, talk, and see why they have this view. See if there was a specific point in time where something clicked in them, like, oh, I'm going to hate this person from now on. And then you can go from there. So just sit and have a conversation, not through text, not through phone, like talk. Go somewhere socially distant and talk.
Chris, that was so eloquently spoken. I can't stress enough how much I agree with that statement. I think this entire show, to me specifically, I didn't want to tell people what to think or how to think. I just want people to understand different sides to this entire story. And the divide between police officers and the people they protect isn't as deep as some may perceive on the internet. And that's something that I want to stress. And I think that last point was so eloquently spoken. Infante, thank you so much for joining.
Right, and quickly to your last point there, it really is like there's a lot of people on Twitter right now and Facebook saying it's all cops. It's all cops are terrible. It's not, and that's what I hate seeing because I grew up with one. I continue to grow up with one, my dad, and all the people in his precinct. And you see the officers that you spoke to, the officers you see in New Brunswick, the officers you see in Camden, the officers you see down in I think it was North Carolina where they had I think it was Richmond or Raleigh, I can't remember, where they were standing in solidarity with these people. It's not all cops. Like there's a lot of people who want to say it's not all white people. Also, it's not all black people. It's not all cops either. And when we realize that, that's when we can start getting together and targeting the real people that we should be targeting. And those are the evil cops that we should be targeting. And so, Nick, thank you for having me. I really appreciate this, and I hope this is a great conversation, and I hope more people, a lot of people listen to this and realize what the real issues is, and I think this is a great way to help that.
No, Chris, thank you so much, and thanks for coming on.
Oh, I appreciate it. Thank you.
And again, a big thank you to Chris Infante for coming on. He hosts the Flipping the Birds podcast for the Philly Sports Network as well. We're live on the Birds in Focus podcast right now. Nick Faria, your host. And look, let's give a summary on what we've learned through those two interviews with Spermuli and Nebus, officers for the East Providence Police Department in Rhode Island, and with Chris Infante, a resident of New Jersey, who works who has a life in Philadelphia and in New York. What's the difference there? Well, Chris was talking about as a minority, he talks about being Puerto Rican and being a minority candidate, a minority person in this country, and how he has lived through some of this prejudice. But we've also seen how just because someone is a minority doesn't mean that, they hate every officer. It also doesn't mean that every officer is off the hook. There are some really bad apples that need to be taken off the force, and there are other good officers that should not be implicated for the actions of the really bad ones. And I think that's something that I've learned through Chris, and that interview was so telling and so important because, yes, there is a divide, but it's not as great as we think. You've heard the officers say pretty much what Chris was saying. We're there for you. We're not trying to get you. We're inherently lazy at the fact that we don't want to arrest people. That's a very interesting point. And this next interview with Dwight Spencer is even more important because Chris, has a background with the police department. He talked about his father being in the NYPD. Dwight doesn't have a family member as a police officer. He's from Miami, Florida, and he's African American. So this hits right at home with Dwight, as opposed to it being a minority thing. This is an African American thing with the Black Lives Matter movement. And Dwight talks about this coming on. And I do want to highlight his entire career to this point because he's still in college, but he's done a lot in college. So Dwight, thank you so much for joining us. Why don't we start with you explaining your background? And tell us about your background, and let's transition that now to the overall thoughts of the George Floyd death.
Well, hey, thank you, Nick, so much for having me on this platform. I once again thank you just for the opportunity to share my thoughts and my convictions, certainly about what's going on in the recent events in our country. So a little bit about me. I'm born and raised right here in beautiful Miami, Florida, a graduate of Miami Country Day School. finishing up my senior year at Florida International University here in Miami. Particularly, I'm a part of the National Association of Black Journalists, an organization that believes in allowing the Black journalists' voices to be heard and all through different mediums, through local and national media outlets, whether that's print, whether that is broadcast, whether that's through sports journalism. I'm also a fellow of the NIA Project, a organization that believes that travel awakens leaders. It is a high school fellowship for high school students here in South Florida that strongly believes in taking underserved youth on travel experiences abroad to really deepen their intellectual senses about travel and why leadership is birthed through travel. And I also curate storytelling and digital storytelling for the organization as well. I've also had the pleasure of being a project coordinator with the American Bar Association's Coalition on Racial and Ethnic Justice. We've done a series of justice hacks throughout the past couple of years, and these justice hacks particularly have taken place here in Miami. We've also done a justice hack in Durham, in the Durham-Raleigh area of North Carolina. We've also went to Chicago, Illinois. And the Justice Hack pretty much is a platform for individuals in our community. We bring together law enforcement, attorneys, educators, and particularly individuals in the technology and coding space, UX and UI design, to come up with prototypes and to come up with ideas and different technologies to really bridge the gap between communities of color and different law enforcement agencies across the country.
So Dwight, and that's a tremendous background with everything that you've done so far, and you haven't even graduated college yet. Congratulations to you. I showed you the interview. I sent you the interview with the police officers earlier today. Now, I'm going to ask you a two-part question. First off, what did you think about the answers the officers gave? And number two, what was your opinion and overall thoughts on the George Floyd death and what's happened in Minneapolis?
I think to start off with what the officers said, I think that they were as transparent as they possibly could. One of the biggest takeaways from that interview was actually in the beginning when the officers clearly said that cops are inherently lazy. And I find that to be very true. In different interactions that I've had with law enforcement agents, most recently one I had a couple of months ago, actually almost a year ago, with a police officer who clearly stated that police don't like to arrest people. And he pretty much was saying police don't like to arrest people because, there's too much paperwork, to go through. You have to go through all this different paperwork. You have to go through all these different steps. And police don't want to arrest individuals and don't want to come to the point of taking people to jail because they just don't feel like going through the motions. They feel like going through, these step-by-step processes. And so I found that to be, just to ring a light bulb in my head because I've actually, spoken with a police officer who has told me, that specific, thing, that's that similar statement to what that officer said. But I found that interview to be particularly transparent. I thought the officers, spoke from the heart, essentially. In regards to the situation that's happening in Minneapolis, when I first saw it, I honestly, I really couldn't believe my eyes, and then to hear, the events leading up, during and after this altercation between, the officers and George Floyd, were quite disheartening. I believe that, that this is, it's an ongoing issue. But it's an ongoing issue that's, slowly, the tarp is, coming off and there's more light that's being shed, on this issue to really, reach the masses and to allow individuals to have their voices heard.
So let me ask you this, because I think this entire show, it's dedicated to bridging the divide between police officers and the people that they protect. Do you feel, and as the police officer said, they feel that 99% of all officers are inherently good. They want to do their jobs right. They want to protect everyone else. Do you feel that that is the case for the majority of them, and this divide is only because of a few bad apples? Or do you think that this is actually something much deeper, as you were alluding to, that it's not just, a few bad apples, it's a system that's being the cause of the problem?
I believe it's a system that's the cause of the issue. I believe that there is a clear divide between particularly officers of color, officers that are not African American or who are not black, and individuals in black and brown communities. I think that the divide is, when you see a white officer rolling down in your community, some people, automatically, the light bulb turns on and the hairs go up because, people are just afraid. People are afraid, of what the consequence may be, between that interaction that they may have. I can say that I've not had many interactions with law enforcement that have been negative, but I've had, I did have one in the past that, that was a negative experience. And, I'm grateful that, it was a peaceful experience. But I think that there's a system that, we have in place. And I don't think that this is a Democrat versus Republican thing. I don't think that this is a black versus white thing. I believe that it's a systematic thing that needs to be addressed, particularly between communities of color and our law enforcement agencies.
So let me ask you this way then. And I'm trying to see if I can put this the right way, because this is such a difficult topic to address. But if we're looking at this from the perspective of, okay, there is a divide and there is a systematic problem, what could possibly bring about that solution? How can we solve that problem? Is it just officers being more involved in the community? Is it hiring more officers of color? Is it hiring different diversities and moving different police precincts and moving them and becoming more racially diverse? So a predominantly African-American community has a predominantly African-American police force. Is that something that you feel needs to happen?
I think that, all of those things that you kind of encapsulated. But I think one of the prevalent things that needs to happen is you need to bring, these officers, and, these law enforcement agencies and these communities of color together. Just have open dialogue and open conversations about the injustices that are happening in our community. And these things don't need to happen, every time, a black individual is killed by a police officer who's of another race. These conversations need to be happening constantly, because because every day the police have to go on the streets and have to patrol the streets. Every day I have to get in my car and I have to go to work. I have to go to school. I have to, go about my daily life. So I think, having this dialogue greater than, just a major event happening will allow people to actually see the true and pure hearts of the people, who are in these different law enforcement agencies and units.
So let me switch gears here, because you make some excellent points in potentially solving this divide between officers and those they protect. But I want to talk about the reaction, what's happened in Minneapolis, because I think, and the officers say the same, you'll be hard-pressed to find people that feel the officers were in the right for murdering George Floyd. Almost everyone you speak to, regardless of where they are politically, believed the officers were in the wrong and they should be criminally charged. And specifically, the officers even said the exact same thing. They felt he should have been charged. But the riots and protests still happened, and there was a difference. And that was where the divide, I think, is. What's a riot? What's a protest? What should be used in each particular point? So I want to ask you, with all these major cities becoming riots, going from protests to riots, where does it start? Does it start with the people that come in with the mindset, we're going to burn down businesses? Or does it come with, and we had another person come on, Chris Infante, say it was actually the police officers because they came in with riot gear. They came out with an aggressive mentality, and that's what made the protest into a riot. What's your opinion on that?
So I'll preface this by saying, particularly here in Miami, there's a peaceful protest on yesterday. That protest then led into just to some police vehicles being set on fire. Mayor Francis Suarez, who's the mayor here in the city of Miami, specifically stated on a press conference earlier in the day that police will not come out in riot gear. Police will not, suit up in any kind of riot gear. They won't put on shields. They won't be putting on face masks or anything. They will instead, be of assistance and aid to these folks that are peacefully protesting. There are protests happening in the community where the police were actually aiding these individuals, and leading them, in these different protests and these different demonstrations that were happening. But particularly, there were a group of bad apples that did come into the community and that decided to say, you know what, we're going to set these police vehicles on fire, and we're going to try and cause harm to the different businesses and entities that, and real estate properties that are, within, the greater Miami community. And what I say to that is, these individuals that are inciting the violence should be, held to the fullest extent of the law. If you're coming into our community, a lot of the times these are individuals who are coming into our community don't even live in Miami, and that are inciting this violence. And so, again, I don't condone, any violence, but, I do say, you have the right to have your voice heard, but your voice should be heard in a manner that does not disrupt, clearly what's already happening, in nationwide, so we're going through a pandemic where individuals, for more than 60 to 90 days have lost their jobs, they're living off of stimulus checks and they're living off of unemployment checks. And to talk about, states and cities slowly beginning to reopen. So we're talking about these local municipalities and these states slowly beginning to reopen, yet, we've got individuals who are setting businesses on fire, who are, smashing it, breaking into businesses. And, all you're doing is prolonging, a pandemic that's now turning into something greater, than a health crisis. Now we're talking about a health crisis, in a justice crisis, combining both, so two wrongs don't make a right. And so I think that, there's obviously ways that we can peaceably protest. But when these events and these demonstrations slowly begin to turn to violence, I believe then it is in the police, police's right to make an example out of the individuals who are causing the harm. And obviously, those who are peacefully protesting to continue to do their job in a safe and effective manner. But again, on that same token, work with these law enforcement agencies and these community governments on how you can do these protests and these demonstrations properly.
You make an interesting point there, Dwight, because I think, and again, when Chris spoke, he spoke about what's going on up north in Philadelphia, in New York City. You're speaking more down south in Miami. And it's interesting that you say it wasn't the officers that started it because, and I believe you mentioned that the government actually said, we're not in riot gear. We're not preparing for a riot. Please respect that same thought process. And I think that's very interesting because pretty much this entire conversation comes down to a few bad apples, a few bad cops ruining it for the good cops because now all of a sudden the good cops are targeted. A few bad protesters that feel they just want to burn everything that looks like a business that ruin the actual conversation that needs to happen from the actual protesters. I think you make a great point there. And I do want to switch the topic because I am writing for a sports network. This is a predominantly sports broadcast that is aired. And I want to talk about the athletes' response, particularly some of them that have recently come out and spoken up against the death of Floyd and what happened with the cops. Carson Wentz, Derek Carr, Zach Ertz, all of them have spoken out in support of the African American community and the Black Lives Matter movement. In your mind, do you feel that it's more important for athletes who are white, like a Carson Wentz from a different background, being from North Dakota of all places, as opposed to, let's say, and I'll put a different wording to this. If Lamar Jackson spoke out against this and Carson Wentz did the exact same thing, do you feel that that adds more to the conversation than just if Lamar Jackson spoke out?
Yes, absolutely. There's the age-old cliche, sports, football, basketball, whatever the case is, bridges the gap, when a lot of time, what we've been hearing lately is sports is that safe haven for individuals. Mm-hmm. Sports is that, that place where people go, to get their mind off of things. And so I think that, every sector, every occupation, has some sort of influence. And we need these influencers, particularly to step up and to speak out, because a lot of the times, people are listening. People, look at these individuals obviously as role models, and obviously as individuals, who even people younger than myself, being 22 years of age, people actually look up to. And so the fact that these athletes are actually speaking out against these injustices actually, I believe is a good thing, because it allows individuals to look up to their role models and look up to people that they see on television every day, that they go to games to, every day, to see that they actually care, that it's more than just, them, getting on the field, throwing around a football, tackling some people, and winning games. It's actually, it's more to the situation to them, and I think, it's even, some of these athletes in particular markets, so we're talking about, the Philadelphias, we're talking about the New Yorks, we're talking about, the Chicagos, and these particular markets that are actually, speaking out against these injustices, because they know that this is more than just, an issue of race. It's an issue of humanity, so to speak.
So let me transition this now to a little bit more of probably a difficult topic as well, because athletes are speaking out everywhere, as you said, and it's important that they do. One athlete that hasn't played because of his stance is Colin Kaepernick. Now, what Kaepernick has said over the last couple of days is he has supported the rioters. Burn this down, continue to burn down the businesses until your voice is heard. Do you feel there's a difference between what Kaepernick is saying and what someone like Carson Wentz and Derek Carr are saying?
I believe they both are in the same boat. Obviously, Colin Kaepernick has a little bit more leverage in the way that people actually, look at him and see him as a civil rights figure and as an activist, for change, because obviously he came out initially, when he began to kneel, during his time with the 49ers. But I believe that, all of these, athletes are in the same boat. I believe that, their words and their voices and their messages actually speak the same thing. It may be, demonstrated differently, it may be said differently, but they all have the same meaning. And so I think that, particularly obviously Colin Kaepernick, someone who has been raising concerns about this for years now, where individuals, either, stood against him because they feel like he was disrespecting, the country and what we stand for, and people, who stand with him, who believe that, these are injustices that are happening and these are things in our country that need to change. But, regardless, of putting, one's message over the other, I think that they're both in the same boat. The messages, still ring the same. These are influential individuals. These are folks, who we again, like, as I've said, we watch on the, on our televisions, we go to games, we see, play the game that they love, but, again, there's a sense of humanity. There's a sense of humbleness that they have to come back to, because they're also human. No one's above the law. No one is above, the injustices that, also happen in our country as well.
So one more question for you, Dwight, before I let you go. If you were to have one giant megaphone that could reach every person in the country right now, what would your message be?
I think my message would be just to listen and learn. I think that, a lot of these riots that have happened, even in many, many years past, have all stemmed from, a sense of anger. And I believe it's okay to be angry. It's absolutely okay to be angry. It's absolutely okay to have a lot of, anguish, on the inside. But, there has to come a time where you have to actually listen and learn. Learn why these situations are happening. Learn why, these injustices are taking place. There's a reason why these events and these demonstrations are taking place. And then particularly on the listen portion, I think, as a Black African, young male in this country, I don't believe in the performative activism. I don't believe, you can just go on social media and say that Black Lives Matter. I believe that, there's leadership that comes, with everything that anybody, says. I don't vote elected officials in office because of what they say. I vote elected officials in office because of what they do and what their actions are. And so if we allow our allies, those that are not, people of color, particularly Black or African Americans, to actually listen and to actually learn what we've, had to go through, as a race and as an ethnicity, I think that we will slowly begin to see, our nation, come together and unite as we should. And again, as I've said earlier, this is not about, a Democrat or Republican thing. It's not a Black versus a white thing. This is a humanity thing. This is about, having everyone be treated as equal, and particularly, the Black and African American community.
Well, Dwight Spencer, so perfectly put there. And I want to thank you for coming on and offering us a different perspective on this entire issue. And I think that's what's so important, having this dialogue. And that's the reason why we're having the show, is to have this dialogue to bridge the gap between officers and the people they protect, bridge the gap between African Americans or minority citizens and white people. And I think that's what's so important about this. So, Dwight, thank you so much for coming on and taking the time for giving your perspective.
Thanks so much, Nick.
And again, a big thank you to Dwight Spencer for coming on and talking about such a difficult issue that's gripping the entire country. And I want to highlight to the audience, we've had now 3 different perspectives coming on. One is from police officers, to extremely safe police officers that have done their job for over 20 years and are the pride and joy of the East Providence Police Department here in Rhode Island. We've had Christian Fonte come on, a Puerto Rican from New Jersey who has experience, obviously, with the Philly Sports Network, but also with the police department, his father being in the NYPD. And then we had Dwight having no one from a police department and having to speak to that as an African American and talking about this divide. And I think the main question is, and I think Dwight was the one that really gave the best answer to it, it's that conversation. You heard Chris highlight the conversation that needs to be had for people that are really highlighting this divide and explaining why this hatred is there. And he talked about Dwight going more in depth and talking about this systemic divide that is there. And whether that's, different solutions to different problems, that's not for me to say. That's not for Dwight to say. That's not for Chris to say. That's for everyone as a country to come up with and solve. Because it's not just the politicians that are doing this, but it's everyone coming together and solve this issue. Because as you've seen and you've heard these interviews, there isn't as big a divide as we really think. We talk about the differences, and there are some differences, and we're not going to sit there and turn blindly to it. There are some differences. Police officers, saying they disagree with the way Kaepernick has attacked the riot, has gone after the riots and defended the riots, and celebrities defending the riots. But Chris, and Chris saying, he doesn't agree with that as well. He feels that the beginning message of Kaepernick should have been the same. But Dwight is defending the Kaepernick move. There are some differences. And guess what? That's what the point of this country is. This isn't I agree with this, I agree with that. Oh my God, we agree. Everything's sunshine and rainbows. That's not the point of the United States. The point of the United States is bringing so many different people together to come up with solutions to problems. Now, is a problem Colin Kaepernick talking and saying for the rioters to continue burning down businesses? No, but it's an important highlight to this that brings apart these differences, because this conversation can happen because of instances like that. This conversation, this dialogue, and this show is so important because it's not all about, well, African Americans are doing this, and cops are doing that, and minorities are doing this, and racists are doing that. It's having this conversation. If someone is being racist, as Chris said, have that conversation. Dwight talking about the systemic problem throughout the entire country. That's the issue. It's not just police officers, it's the country that has this systemic problem. And the officers basically imploring with the audience, saying, this isn't a thing that happens. This isn't normal. We aren't condoning the actions of these cops that murdered George Floyd because we don't agree with how they did it. It's so important to have this dialogue, and this show has gone on longer than any other Birds in Focus show because this issue is so important to talk about, having this dialogue. And I stress to our viewers, I'm not telling you what to think. I'm telling you, have this conversation. If there's one thing that you should learn coming out of this, it's A, don't hate your fellow man. You've heard Carson Wentz say it. You've heard officers say it. You've heard minorities say it. Don't hate your fellow man, but also have a dialogue. You heard from the officers how important it was to have that dialogue with the community, and East Providence has some very good police officers doing that, having that dialogue with that community, being on the same page as the people that you are hired to protect, but also understanding that there's a problem here. There is, and I think that's an important piece to that, and trying to find that dialogue, speaking with your congressional representatives, speaking with representatives and senators and your city council members, and trying to solve these issues are so important. And I really do think if you take one thing away from here, it's to have that dialogue. Don't hate, but have that dialogue with people that aren't like you to figure out a way to solve this problem and to be a better nation and be a better person because of this. So I want to thank Mike Spramuli and Bill Nebus of the East Providence Police Department. I want to thank Chris Infante of the Philly Sports Network and Dwight Spencer for coming on and having this dialogue, having this conversation to making this country a little bit better. This country is better now following this conversation than before this conversation. And it's those little baby steps we have to take to get to the point where we need to be as a nation. So signing off, I'm Nick Faria. Thank you so much for listening and having this dialogue with me. And again, a big thank you to Mike, Bill, Chris, and Dwight for coming on as well. We'll have our regular show broadcast next weekend as well. Hope to go back into the sports world. But again, there are some things bigger than sports, and I hope this week highlighted that for you as well. So signing off, I'm Nick Faria saying have a great day, better tomorrow, and be safe.
The views and opinions expressed on today's show are not reflective of the Philly Sports Network. Thanks for listening to the Birds in Focus podcast.